Vietnam War True Stories, Ed Freeman at Ia Drang, 1965. In November of 1965, deep in the central highlands of South Vietnam, American soldiers found themselves surrounded in a place that would become one of the most famous battlefields of the Vietnam War. It was called the Ia Drang Valley. To the men on the ground, it was not just a valley. It was heat, smoke, fear, jungle, noise, and survival. It was the place where the United States Army fought its first major battle against regular North Vietnamese forces. It was the place where helicopter warfare was tested under fire. And it was the place where ordinary men were asked to do impossible things. Among those men was a helicopter pilot named Ed W. Freeman. He was tall, quiet, determined, and already a veteran before Vietnam ever called his name. Because of his height, he had once been told he was too tall to fly helicopters. But by 1965, he was in Vietnam flying for the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, 1st Cavalry Division, a unit built around a new idea of war, air mobility. The helicopter had changed the battlefield. Instead of moving soldiers only by foot, truck, or armored convoy, commanders could now lift troops over jungle, mountains, rivers, and enemy territory. They could place infantry directly into remote landing zones that had no roads, no towns, and no safe route in or out. But that also meant something dangerous. Once those men were dropped into a landing zone, the helicopter became their lifeline. It brought in ammunition. It brought in water. It brought in medical supplies. It carried out the wounded. It brought hope in the middle of chaos. At Ia Drang, that lifeline would be tested like never before. The battle began around Landing Zone X-Ray, a small clearing near the Chu Pong Massif, close to the Cambodian border. American soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry were inserted by helicopter into the area. They expected contact, but few fully understood the size and strength of the enemy waiting nearby. The North Vietnamese Army was there in force. Experienced, disciplined, and heavily armed, the enemy moved through the terrain with purpose. The jungle around LZ X-Ray quickly became a battlefield. Shots rang out. Mortars fell. Machine guns opened up. Men hit the ground wherever they could find cover. The landing zone became a storm of dust, rotor wash, smoke, shouting, and gunfire. Helicopters came in low, dropped soldiers, lifted off, circled back, and came in again. But as the fighting intensified, the landing zone became more and more dangerous. Enemy fire reached into the clearing. Helicopters were hit. Pilots and crewmen were wounded. Some aircraft were damaged. The risk grew with every approach. Then came the order. The landing zone was considered too dangerous for medical evacuation helicopters. Medevac aircraft were ordered not to go in. The fire was too heavy. The risk was too great. But wounded men were still lying on the ground. They were bleeding in the grass. They were calling for help. Some were too badly hurt to move. Others were carried by their comrades toward whatever helicopter might still dare to land. That is when Ed Freeman made his decision. He was not flying a dedicated medical evacuation helicopter. His aircraft was a transport helicopter, a UH-1 Huey. His job was not supposed to be flying into a hot landing zone again and again after medevac had been stopped. But Freeman understood what was happening below him. He knew the men on the ground were running out of supplies. He knew they needed ammunition. He knew they needed water. He knew the wounded needed to be lifted out before it was too late. So he flew in anyway. And then he flew in again. And again. And again. Each trip into LZ X-ray meant descending into a battlefield where bullets could tear through the aircraft at any moment. There was no guarantee he would make it in. No guarantee he would lift off again. No guarantee that the next burst of enemy fire would not bring his helicopter down into the clearing. But Freeman kept coming. His helicopter cut through smoke and gunfire, bringing supplies to men who were fighting for their lives. Ammunition was critical. In a battle like Ia Drang, running out of ammunition could mean being overrun. Every box mattered. Every resupply mattered. Every landing mattered. Then he took wounded men out. Some had been shot. Some were torn by shrapnel. Some were barely conscious. Some were carried aboard by soldiers who had no time to say much of anything. They loaded the wounded as quickly as they could while the helicopter sat exposed in the landing zone. A helicopter on the ground in a hot LZ is vulnerable. It cannot maneuver. It cannot hide. It cannot outrun bullets. For those few seconds or minutes, it is a target. Yet Freeman stayed long enough to take men aboard. Then the Huey lifted up through the danger, carrying wounded soldiers away from the killing ground. For the men trapped at LZ X-ray, the sound of Freeman's helicopter was more than machinery. It was the sound of someone refusing to abandon them. The Ia Drang Valley was not a clean battlefield. It was not neat. It was not distant. It was close, brutal, and personal. Soldiers fought in grass, elephant grass, scattered trees, and broken ground. Units were separated. Enemy troops pushed close. At times, the battle came down to small groups of men holding lines under extreme pressure. The wounded kept coming. And so did Freeman. Reports of his actions describe him flying repeated missions into the landing zone under intense enemy fire. He brought in desperately needed supplies and evacuated many wounded soldiers who otherwise may not have survived. Some accounts state that he flew 14 separate missions into the hot landing zone after medevac flights had been halted. Think about that for a moment. Not once. Not twice. 14 times. Each time, he had to make the approach. Each time, he had to land or hover low enough to deliver supplies or pick up wounded. Each time, he had to expose himself, his crew, and his aircraft to enemy fire. Each time, he had to lift off and survive long enough to return. That kind of courage is difficult to measure. There is the courage of a soldier holding a rifle on the ground. There is the courage of a medic crawling to a wounded man. There is the courage of a commander making decisions while men are dying around him. And then there is the courage of a pilot who can see the danger from above, who knows exactly what waits below, and chooses to descend anyway. Ed Freeman could have stayed out. He could have obeyed the danger. He could have said the landing zone was too hot. He could have waited for conditions to improve. Many would have understood. No one could honestly say the danger was imagined. But there were men down there. That was enough. To understand Freeman's story, you have to understand what the helicopter meant in Vietnam. The Huey became one of the defining symbols of the war. Its sound is still tied to Vietnam in the memory of those who served there. The thump of rotor blades could mean many things. It could mean insertion, extraction, resupply, evacuation, fire support, reinforcement. To wounded men, it could mean life. But flying a helicopter in Vietnam was a dangerous job. Pilots often came in low and slow. They flew into landing zones where the enemy waited for them. They faced small arms fire, machine guns, mortars, rockets, bad weather, jungle terrain, and the constant threat of mechanical failure. A helicopter pilot had to trust his crew. The crew chief watched the aircraft, the door gunners watched the ground, and the pilot had to read the landing zone while making decisions in seconds. One bad approach could end in disaster. One moment of hesitation could cost lives. At Ia Drang, the pilots were not just moving soldiers. They were keeping the battle alive. The 1st Cavalry Division had been built around the idea that helicopters could give American forces speed and flexibility. Ia Drang proved that air mobility could bring troops into battle quickly, but it also revealed the terrifying reality of being inserted into a remote fight against a determined enemy. When the enemy surrounded or pressured the landing zone, the helicopters had to return through fire to keep the soldiers supplied. This made Ed Freeman's actions even more important. Every time he brought ammunition in, he gave the men on the ground another chance to hold. Every time he carried wounded out, he gave them a chance to live. Every time he returned, he reminded those men they had not been forgotten. There is a powerful emotional truth in stories like this. In war, courage is often remembered not only because of what a man did, but because of what his actions meant to others. For the wounded soldier lying in the grass, Freeman's helicopter was not a statistic. It was not a military concept. It was not air mobility doctrine. It was rescue. For the men still fighting, the supplies he brought were not just boxes. They were survival. For the commanders trying to hold LZ X-ray, his repeated flights were not just bravery. They were a lifeline. The battle raged with extraordinary violence. The Americans at LZ X-ray fought against strong North Vietnamese forces that pressed them hard. The enemy used the terrain, the jungle, and close assault tactics. American artillery, air support, and helicopter resupply played crucial roles. But none of that erased the human cost. Men were killed. Men were wounded. Men watched friends fall beside them. Units endured exhaustion, fear, and confusion. The battle became a defining moment for many who survived it. Ed Freeman's name would become tied forever to that field. But like many heroes, recognition did not come immediately in the way it should have. For decades, his actions were remembered by those who knew what he had done, especially the men whose lives had been touched by his courage. But official recognition at the highest level came much later. In 2001, Ed Freeman received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Ia Drang. By then, many years had passed since the smoke and noise of 1965. But the meaning of what he did had not faded. The Medal of Honor citation recognized that he had flown through heavy enemy fire to deliver supplies and evacuate wounded soldiers from a landing zone that had been closed to medical evacuation helicopters. It recognized the risk. It recognized the repeated missions. It recognized the lives saved. But for the men who were there, no medal was needed to know what kind of man he was. They already knew. They knew because they had heard the helicopter return. They knew because they had seen him land. They knew because wounded men who might have died in that clearing were carried out. One of the most powerful parts of Freeman's story is that he did not act alone in the sense of being the only brave man at Ia Drang. The battle was filled with courage. Infantrymen held their lines. Medics treated the wounded. Artillerymen and air crews did their jobs under pressure. Commanders made difficult decisions. Other pilots also flew dangerous missions. But Freeman's actions stand out because of the deliberate choice to keep returning when the danger was obvious and the mission was desperate. It is one thing to be caught in danger. It is another thing to fly away from it, turn around, and go back into it. That is what he did. Again and again. There is a reason veterans remember helicopter pilots with such deep emotion. In Vietnam, the men in the helicopters were often the first faces seen going in and the last hope coming out. The relationship between the troops on the ground and the pilots in the air was built on trust. A soldier climbing into a Huey had to believe the pilot would get him there. A wounded man being lifted out had to believe the aircraft would survive long enough to carry him away. At Ia Drang, Ed Freeman honored that trust in the most dangerous way possible. The story also tells us something about leadership and duty. Freeman was not seeking glory. He was not acting for headlines. He was responding to a battlefield need. The men on the ground needed help, and he had the skill and the aircraft to help them. So he did. That simple truth is often at the heart of real heroism. Not speeches. Not drama. Not a desire to be remembered. Just a man seeing what had to be done and doing it, even when fear and reason both argued against it. The Ia Drang battle would later be remembered through books, interviews, documentaries, and film. It became a symbol of the early Vietnam War, when American forces met the North Vietnamese army in large-scale combat and began to understand the kind of conflict they were entering. It was a battle of courage, but also a warning. The enemy was disciplined and willing to take heavy losses. The terrain favored those who knew it. Air mobility could bring American power quickly, but it could also place men into remote and deadly situations. Firepower mattered, but so did endurance. Technology mattered, but so did human will. And in the middle of all that stood people like Ed Freeman. His nickname was Too Tall. That nickname carried a certain irony. A man once considered too tall for helicopter flight became one of the most remembered helicopter pilots of the Vietnam War. His height might have made him stand out, but his courage is what made his name endure. At Ia Drang, Too Tall Freeman became larger than life not because he sought legend, but because he refused to turn away from wounded men. Imagine the view from his cockpit. Smoke rising from the landing zone. Men running below. The flash of gunfire in the trees. Radio calls coming through. The aircraft vibrating. The door gunners watching for threats. The knowledge that the enemy understood exactly what helicopters meant and would try to shoot them down. Then the descent. Lower and lower into the danger. Dust and debris whipping beneath the rotors. Soldiers moving toward the aircraft. Supplies going out. Wounded men coming in. Seconds stretching into eternity. Then the climb back out. The helicopter heavy with wounded. The enemy firing. The pilot holding control. The crew scanning for danger. The aircraft pulling away from the landing zone and heading toward care. Then, after landing the wounded, after seeing the damage, after knowing exactly how close death had come, turning back. That is the part that defines him. Turning back. Many men can be brave once when there is no choice. Freeman was brave repeatedly when he did have a choice. He chose the men on the ground. The wounded men carried out by Freeman's helicopter were not numbers. They were sons, husbands, fathers, brothers, friends, and fellow soldiers. Some survived because someone came for them when others could not. Some lived to return home, to tell their stories, to build families, to remember the men who did not make it. That is the ripple of one man's courage. A decision made in a cockpit in 1965 could echo through generations. the men he helped save did not simply survive a battle. They carried the memory of that rescue for the rest of their lives. Their families existed in part because someone refused to leave them behind. That is why stories like Ed Freeman's matter. They remind us that history is not only made by generals, presidents, or policies. It is made by men who act in moments where no one can fake character. When a landing zone is under fire, when wounded men are waiting, when every instinct says stay away, a man's true measure is revealed. Ed Freeman's measure was courage. His story belongs not only to the history of the Vietnam War, but to the larger story of service itself. It speaks to every soldier who ever waited for extraction, every medic who ever called for help, every pilot who ever flew into danger, and every family who knows that survival sometimes depends on someone else's bravery. At Ia Drang, the men of the 1st Cavalry Division fought one of the hardest battles of the early war. They faced a determined enemy and suffered heavy losses. But they also showed extraordinary resilience. And above them, through smoke and fire, Ed Freeman flew. He did not stop when the landing zone was declared too dangerous. He did not stop when the risk was clear. He did not stop because wounded men were still waiting. In the years after the war, as Vietnam veterans struggled for recognition, stories like Freeman's became even more important. They helped remind America that whatever people thought of the war, the courage of the men who served there could not be questioned. Those men fought for each other. That truth runs through Vietnam veteran stories again and again. In the jungle, in the rice paddies, in the fire bases, in the helicopters, and in the hospitals, men learned that survival depended on the person next to them. Politics was far away. The mission was confusing. The war was complicated. But your buddy was real. The wounded man calling for help was real. The helicopter coming in through fire was real. Ed Freeman's actions cut through all the noise of history and leave us with something simple and powerful. Men needed him. He came. They needed him again. He came again. If you have any photos, videos, or stories to share, please send us a message. And to all veterans, thank you for your service.